Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. Rev 250 is a consortium of about 70 groups in and around Massachusetts, looking at ways we can commemorate the beginnings of the American Revolution. And I am Bob Allison, the chair of the advisory committee and a professor of history at Suffolk. And our guest today is one of the most prolific authors on the Revolution, Patrick Griffin, who is currently the Harmsworth Professor at Oxford University, although he is also the Madden-Hennebry Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Notre Dame. Thanks for joining us, Patrick.
Oh, Bob, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And you've written a number of really extraordinary books that really help us rethink the revolution. The one you're working on now is on the age of Atlantic revolutions. Can you tell us a little bit about that as a project?
Yeah, so it just starts with a question, so how do we explain what happened in the Atlantic world between 1750 and 1850, right? And so a simple span of 100 years, but of course, as you know, the world was turned upside down. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, revolution in Haiti, Latin American independence, rebellion in Ireland, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so the book is just really an attempt to try to see how we can tie all of these together. And what it's going to basically argue is that really what occurred was what I call a crisis of connection. And over the course of the 18th century, the Atlantic was transformed because of trade, because of movement of people and movement of ideas. And through that, anyway, it created, if you will, kind of a crisis that the state had to respond to. The state responds with reform, and reform initiates revolution. Then it tries to understand, if you will, kind of how does one revolution kind of set off another? And it's not really that simple. It's just because all of these places are enmeshed in the same dynamic process, even as they're all bound and connected together, which creates, if you will, almost like this kaleidoscopic effect around it. So that's what the book is going to be looking at. So it was quite a challenge because I had to do a heck of a lot of reading over lots of different literatures.
Right.
So yeah, glad it's done nearly.
Look forward to reading it. And then you also, it's kind of in a similar vein to the book you did on the Townsend Brothers, these two brothers who are engaged in the British Empire in different ways.
Yeah, it definitely is. And so actually it was I'll tell you what, when I was writing the Townsend book, it was, if you will, some sort of unanswered questions. And when I started to see bigger implications of the kinds of things I was writing about there, and when I saw these two brothers enmeshed in, that's what led me to write the book about the age of Atlantic revolutions, because I quickly discovered that these two brothers, Charles and George Townsend, really weren't all that different than lots of other people throughout the broader Atlantic world, in the way that they were reacting to what was happening to the kind of seismic changes around them, and how they were trying to kind of formulate a plan for empire, and how that plan inevitably led to kind of revolution in America.
Right. Yeah.
And I said, oh, wait a minute, this seems to be happening at other places too. And so it really kind of the questions that I had from the Townsend Brothers book was the one that generated kind of like the ideas that led to the new one.
Yeah. So what were some of the big changes happening? It seems like there's a realization now that Britain has an empire and we need to do something about it. And then,
Britain, of course, Britain had an empire before, but it wasn't an empire that functioned the way we would think about empire, right? And so, I mean, obviously, Britain could lay claim to lots of places, and then kind of the center was bound to various peripheries in all different kinds of ways. But for the most part, the state didn't really have that capacity to kind of act on what it wanted to do, and didn't have the capacity to kind of amalgamate these places into a coherent whole. And I think what happens over the course of the 18th century is that these various states have no option but to try to do so. And that's because of the dizzying changes that are occurring in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And these have to do with kind of this, like the movement of free migrants across the ocean, but particularly the movement of slaves across the ocean. And as this happens, then this Atlantic space becomes much, much more productive as it becomes exploitative. And at the same moment as it's becoming much, much more productive anyway, there's ships going back and forth with greater regularity. The networks themselves become denser. And then because of it now, and because war making is becoming so much more expensive, states have to act and have to try to do something and figure out, what the heck do we do with this space? How do we manage it? How do we kind of make sure that that some of the profitability is going to make its way into our treasuries and everything like that?
Yeah. Yeah. Was the concept of the Atlantic world around then, or did people think of themselves as being part of this world, or was it?
They didn't I mean, as far as I know anyway, they're not using, well, they certainly
Yeah.
weren't using the term Atlantic world, but they
Mhm.
knew, I would say that this is the kind of imaginations were focused upon this watery space.
Mhm.
Like just think about, like, I think probably two of the most important novels of the 18th century. And one would be, Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's
Yeah.
Travels,
Mhm.
and of course, Robinson Crusoe by
Right.
Defoe. And you think about both, we know the stories
Right.
really, really well, but to
Mhm.
think about what they mean, it's like starts with the adventure, it starts with the
Right.
lure
Mhm.
of the Atlantic. And I think that's not exceptional at all, that more and more people were kind of transfixed with areas across the Atlantic.
Mhm.
And as this became not only a kind of a site of imagination for them, but became kind of a very real place that they were bound to by
Mhm.
all of these things. So, for example, if you're like living in some place, like just say, for example, like the north of Ireland somewhere or something like
Mhm.
that, and you're making linen, right? You're
Yeah.
just like a poor person making linen.
Mhm.
Well, you know that linen is going to be crossing the ocean, and you
Mm.
know that the flaxseed that
Yeah.
you need to make that linen is being grown in places like upstate New York,
Right. Yeah.
or what would be upstate New York. So what happens is, because of the way the Atlantic changes, is people are kind of imaginatively bound to different places in like really new and profound ways.
Mhm.
And even though they wouldn't have used the term Atlantic world, it was, if you will, the space itself and the way the space is changing is
Right.
really gripping their imaginations.
Right. Right. Now, you also have done a bit on Ireland,
Yeah.
and your first book was on the Ulster Scots, the people with no name, and then you and Frank Cogliano just co-edited a book on Ireland and America, looking at these two worlds. Can you tell us a little bit about how Ireland fits into all of this?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, for me, it's just that stemmed really from the first book I wrote, like you said. So the people with no name was a study of these migrants who were coming over,
Yeah.
and I tried to make an argument that it's actually these migrants are the people who are creating, if you will, the concept of an Atlantic world by their
Mhm.
movement,
Right.
but also by these acts of imagination I was just talking about. And so I think that these two places, an ocean apart, are places that just lend themselves beautifully to doing comparative history. And
Mhm.
when historians want to do comparative history, because it makes you look at the places you think you know already well, it makes you think
Yeah.
about them in new and exciting ways.
Mhm.
And so Ireland lines up with America in so many ways, but it's still distinct in other kinds of ways. And that makes
Right.
it a beautiful comparative case. And so in the book that Frank and I did, it was that we got a murderer's row of historians in there, just
Yeah.
some really, really fine people. And we brought them together. And so they're largely Americanists. And we just said, we want you to think about the Irish case. And we
Right.
want you to think about what you normally write about in light of the Irish case.
Mhm.
And what happened was a really extraordinary sort of kind of a rethink of, we think, America at the time in light of what
Mhm.
went on in Ireland. And so it just lends itself to that beautifully. But also, getting to the things I was just talking about, it's not only comparative, it's because Ireland and America are bound together in so many ways as well. So you can do what
Mhm.
we call, a fancy word is like entangled history, the way that
Yeah.
these two places are bound and tied, connected together.
Mhm.
This is also something that you can do. So you can do comparative and entangled history at the same time. And that's
Yeah.
what makes, I think, looking at Ireland, for an Americanist anyway, like me,
Yeah.
such an exciting thing to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. So that experiment worked, getting historians who typically focus on one thing and
Yeah.
asking them to look at it in a slightly different way. Would you say that's a model for what we should be doing, or do you think that was such a unique ability to get those people who were able to do? I can see it going badly in a lot of ways.
Oh, no, no, it can go badly, but you got to get the right people. And we were really
Yeah.
fortunate. I mean, like I say, it was just some incredible historians,
Mhm.
just really decided to give it a shot and give it a
Mhm.
try. But the thing about it is, I think more and more of us are doing those kinds of
Yeah.
work, doing that kind of work, doing like transnational history.
Mhm.
And it's not any kind of like, we're not like splitting atoms or anything
Yeah.
like that. But what it is, it's just a recognition of kind of the worlds these people lived in.
Right.
So, of
Yeah.
course, when we think about like America, there was no United States.
Right.
And if you're sitting there in mid-18th century, you're not dreaming of a United States. That's just
Mhm.
something that's not even on the horizon. Your world is still
Mhm.
kind of mediated by a place across the ocean, and you
Right.
are bound in some way or another to that. And so it's just really kind of a recognition for the way these people's lived their lives,
Yeah.
and I think that's what we're trying to do. So certainly kind of a lot of the people that we had from that generation, some of them are like phenomenal Atlantic historians,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
like Nicholas Canny. He's
Right.
always
Yeah. Oh,
doing
yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah.
But there's others who have, have always couched their kind of work in these broader Atlantic terms, but never really said it. Like a guy like, say, for example, Gordon Wood,
Right.
who's also in there,
Yeah.
But I mean, he knows things that are happening across the ocean
Yeah.
as well as anything else, and just become much more intentional about it,
Right.
and then they all were happy to do so.
It seems like an effort to forget what we know and look at what we don't know or don't pretend not to know, because our focus has been as American historians on the creation of the United States, when that wasn't what these people were thinking about doing. They're not saying we're going to create the United States. They're living in their own world, and we as historians are rediscovering that or reimagining it in the way they were.
Yeah, I think so. I think that we are doing exactly that. And again, it's like some historians have been doing this for a long, long time. But I think now what you have is a generation of historians, particularly, who are trying to say, well, these questions of kind of who we are, the American national questions still matter, right? But I think we had reached kind of like dead ends about kind of answering that. We had kind of already said, well, we've come to kind of certain kind of considerations of what that is. So we're still asking those kinds of questions now, but I think we're placing people back in their proper context in order to do so. You can't get to the question of how they became American by just putting them in America. You have to, again, think about the way that they would have constituted their worlds.
Right. Now, were the people in Ireland becoming Irish at this time, or is that a different story?
Yeah, they certainly were through the broader kind of age of revolution. So many people, nearly all people in Ireland would have called themselves Irish. That is, if you were churchmen, members of the established church. If you were Catholics, that'd be 3/4 of the population. But even people who were dissenters, who may just be kind of a generation or two removed from, say, like a place like Scotland or places in England. A lot of these people, they all consider themselves to be, increasingly, they would use the term, to be Irish. And some of that has to do with kind of, they had a simultaneous sort of like a attraction and repulsion to kind of Britain at the same time. Like they wanted the connection to Britain, but they really kind of bridled at that connection. And to a certain extent, and this is nothing new with me. This actually goes back to something like Bernard Bailyn, another historian by the name of John Clive, came up with this kind of notion that they were also provincials, and they had there were certain dilemmas associated with being a provincial. And so people start to kind of like, if you will, kind of carve out a distinctive niche for who they are, just to make sense of themselves, because you have this like guerrilla that's kind of just living to your east. So how do you define yourself? And I think that's one of the interesting stories about the Irish, anyway, in the 18th century, is that, if you will, these definitions go through so many different permutations because the broader world is spinning and changing around them so quickly. And so, if you will, the 18th century is them trying to figure out what it actually means to be Irish, Does it mean that you have to put up boundaries between each other? Does it mean you have to have more permeability? That kind of thing. And so I think they're not unique in this regard. I think kind of all peoples, because of the tumult of the 18th century, are really trying to figure out, in real generative ways, who they are.
Right. And do you see that as part of the process in the 19th century, and now that you're looking into the age of revolutions beyond the 18th century?
Yeah, completely. And I think, if anything, that becomes one of the defining characteristics of the 19th century, is that whereas people are kind of groping for understandings of who they are, by the 19th century, they are insistently looking for it. And to a certain extent, they're doing this because it's not only kind of the era of nationalism, it's because the very idea of nation itself becomes such an important buttress to the state. And more people, the idea of who we are is not just, as I suggested before, a provincial dilemma, like a cultural issue. It has real political charge, has real political meaning. And the Irish are invested in this right away. And you're going to find a breakdown in society between those people who are going to be like thoroughgoingly Irish, and to be Irish is to break the union with Britain. And other people who had, like a generation before, considered themselves Irish, are increasingly going to start thinking of themselves as being British. In other words, we have to maintain the union, and so sense of self or identity becomes so bound to kind of like state dynamics, to politics, that I think in the 19th century, if anything, that question becomes even more charged.
Wow, interesting. So how does the American Revolution change this or impact this? That can either be a small question or a big one.
Oh yeah, no, well, to one thing is the American Revolution, of course, is going to be the first revolution of the age. And because of that, it's going to create like a template for other peoples in other places.
Yeah.
Not in the sense that people are saying, hey, what are those people across the ocean when they seem to be remaking themselves, right? They're considering themselves Americans. We have to do the same. What I think is going to happen is a lot of people around the broader Atlantic world are going to look what's happening in America and see kind of possibilities for change that they wouldn't have imagined before. I think that's going to be the most catalytic thing the American Revolution is going to do. But the fact that Americans are discovering themselves as American in the late 18th and early 19th century, other peoples are going to do exactly the same thing for the same kinds of reasons, because caught up in this world of tumult, caught up in a world where more and more people are politicized, more and more people are mobilized, means that more and more people really have a pressing need to define who they are. And Americans are doing it, the French are doing it, the Irish, of course, I just mentioned, are doing it, the British are even doing it at the same time. There's almost a mania, but I think this mania has to do with the fact that so much kind of like human energy is released at the time of this age of revolution. So many men are mobilized and put under arms now that it's really important for the state to have people consider themselves yoked to the state in new kinds of ways. It happens in America. It happens in these other places too.
Well, so human energy is released, and at the same time, you then have the state growing.
Absolutely. And the state grows from that. So a state, you know, the one other great thing about the age is kind of the growth of state capacity. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying states become stronger than they have before. Why have they become stronger? Because they've got to fight wars and they're engaged in revolution as never before. And this means that you have to have more and more people who are going to be lending their muscle and lending everything they have to the state to do the things the state needs to do.
Right.
Well, those people create opportunities, but they also create problems. What are the opportunities? Well, it means the state can do more than it ever could have imagined before, because now so many people are off fighting for the state, for example. But it also means that if a state wants to kind of return to kind of an orderly way of doing things, a lot of people who have been bearing arms in an age of revolution becomes a real big problem. How do you tie them then anew to the state? Well, you kind of have them become either Frenchmen or Americans or British or Irish. That's the way it usually happens.
Interesting. So let's talk about these two agents of the state that you wrote a book about, Charles and George Townsend, who are similar in some ways, different in some ways. One's focus is North America. Charles Townsend's the one, of course, Americans know the most about. George Townsend's focus is Ireland. So what are these two guys all about?
Oh, they are. You know, at first I thought that as I was studying them, and I just said, oh, it's pretty cool to do a study of brothers, and it allows me to do kind of a sneaky comparative history. That's what it started out as. And then I said, oh my gosh, these guys are amazing. They're so kind of unique and so distinctive in what they're doing and their talents and their abilities and kind of the visions that they're dreaming up. And then I found they were much like everybody else. They were much like everybody else, doing what other people in Britain were doing at the time. They were engaged in, I think, one of the great debates of their period. And that is like, after the 7 Years' War, how do you make empire work? That's what they were trying to both do. And they had their distinctive answers. And the book goes through kind of the ins and the outs of how they come to the answers they do and what those answers mean. But ultimately, they create what I call as a complementary vision of empire, that before you can start extracting money from America, before you can kind of start, if you will, cajoling the Irish to give you more troops to serve serve for empire, you have to reform the political structures. And so at the very moment Charles is kind of dreaming up his duties, right? The duties are there, not so much to just kind of get money, but they're there to reform the relationship between center and periphery. And George is going to be doing exactly the same thing at about the same time for Ireland. And so the hope is, with this complementary vision, that Ireland can actually then provide more men because you've reformed, if you will, the structures. And America, with time, can provide some money because you reformed the political structures. You would then have a centralized empire that could actually function and work in this world, in a hyper competitive world. Because even though the British had just won the war, the 7 Years' War, this is history's first world war, a massive war, bigger than anything people had ever imagined before. They knew it's just a matter of time before the French come back. That's the way that things work. And so you got to be prepared for the next one. And so you have to reform empire in order to, if you will, survive in this kind of world. And so the Townsend brothers, at first, to me, again, they looked kind of distinctive, but then I realized everybody is coming up with their kind of own variations on this theme, you know. And so some say, well, you know, tax the Americans, that's the answer. Others say, no, don't tax the Americans. kind of have it the way that
Right.
it was before, like Edmund Burke would say that,
Mm-hmm.
famously. But the brothers are going to kind of say, no, 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 we have to come up with a system. We have to come up with a system to make this thing work. And that's going to be the structure of empire. And as I put it, they just happen to get on the stage at a real propitious time, and so they're able to enact their measures. And when they enact their measures, of course, the world blows up.
Right, right. Were they doing this in concert, or was each one operating independently the way these other characters are all?
That's a tough one, because I'll tell you what, they certainly came up with their ideas in concert with each other. Their visions of what would happen. And Charles is going to be important, instrumental really, in ensuring that George is going to get the job he did. George had besmirched his name a number of times, and the book goes into how and why that happened. But Charles is going to be instrumental in getting his brother that plum position, becoming Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Right. So it wasn't as if so much that they're saying, hey, what you do is you get the money and I'll get the men. They're not so much saying that, but they both believe that empire has to be reformed. They both believe that. And they both go out and try to reform the bit that they're responsible for. Right. And so because of it, then they necessarily come up with very, very similar ideas, even though like reforming Ireland is a dramatically different sort of kind of task than reforming the relationship between Britain and America at the time. But they're both intent on doing that. But again, as I say, the amazing thing about it to me is like so many other people around are intent on doing it as well, but they just have their own distinctive way.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that George wanted to reform Ireland as Lord Lieutenant?
Well, Ireland was bound to Britain by what was called the undertaker system. An undertaker doesn't mean kind of like a bunch of people taking out dead men or anything like that. Undertakers were people who would ostensibly undertake the business of Britain, and then they would be able to dole out patronage. That's the way they worked. And so Britain more or less could kind of leave Ireland well enough alone. Okay, they'll take care of the patronage. They'll get the job done for us. Yes, it's corrupt. We know that. But what the heck, we're not going to worry about it.
Yeah.
Well, with the increased demands of empire after the 7 Years' War, that old system, that old arrangement was just not working anymore. And Britain needed more than anything else, needed more manpower, more troops. And Ireland had this vast store of manpower. How do you tap into it? At first, they tried to work with the undertaker system, and then it flopped completely. And so George says there's only one way we can do it. We have to undermine the undertaker system. So what he does then is he stays in Dublin, and he becomes, if you will, the chief undertaker. He becomes like the chief ward boss. Yeah. Imagine he becomes like the Mayor Daley of all of Ireland. Yeah. And everybody's got to come to him for goodies. Yeah. And what happens then, he hands out goodies to people who are going to do favors for him. Right. And he's able to get a number of people on his side. And then all of these corrupt players, these undertakers then, are completely sidelined, and he becomes the chief distributor of goodies. Yeah. And that remakes everything overnight. So whereas before the Lord Lieutenant was just kind of like basically on the sidelines watching all of this happen, now the Lord Lieutenant becomes, if you will, the chief official in Ireland and the one who can actually make things happen. And this is kind of reforms the relationship between the two. And then soon enough, if you will, Ireland is able then to kind of Parliament is able to vote through more money to be raised for troops for Ireland, which the empire desperately needs.
Well, it is election day in Boston, so I was inevitably thinking about the way James Michael Curley did a similar thing, putting the ward bosses out of business, and he becomes the central one. It's now I'm wondering if that example was before them or just smart politics to do that.
Oh, it's just smart politics, tried and true way of doing things, right?
Yeah. Good. So, but I'm thinking, at this time, of course, Britain is in the process of acquiring India. That is, the empire is expanding at the same time as the Townsend Brothers is thinking about ways of making it work. So there's, for me, kind of a question of which comes first, the expansion or the reform.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. And I think that, actually, like Charles Townsend is going to try to address exactly the question, Bob, that you just put out there. And a lot of people are going to say, like, hey, we got to kind of think about India. How's India going to be fit into this whole thing? Or should we expand more there? Or what should we do? And some people are going to say that we actually have to start taxing the East India Company. Yeah. Now, Charles is going to suggest, no, not a good idea at this point. Now, to a certain extent, some have claimed that kind of he had family investments there, and that wouldn't have been a good idea for his investment. Whatever the case, though, he justifies it this way. He says, the levels of development are not there yet enough that we can actually make them part of the empire. but the American colonies are. So let's focus on making them part of the system. Maybe with time, India will become part of that system right now, but that would be kind of getting ahead of ourselves. And so he does for India actually what some people, officials in Britain, are saying like to do for the West of America. Leave it alone for now. Leave it alone. Okay, it's maybe going to be an area of future development, but it's not something for us to mess around with right now. So these issues are clearly on their mind. You know, the funny thing, it gets back to the question you asked earlier about kind of the Atlantic and the Atlantic world. Yes, this is increasingly going to be a global empire, and consciously so, right, with India. But people don't quite know yet how to amalgamate it. Remember, the only templates they have of kind of sovereignty and rule, of like centralized rule, is kind of like what works, if you will, within the British Isles.
Right.
And they try to extend that notion of parliamentary sovereignty right out to the American colonists. That's what they try to do. And they say, well, the Americans claim, hey, we're not voting for anything. We're not really represented. And they say, you're virtually represented.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We know that story. But India, they couldn't say it. India is a bridge too far.
Right.
And a lot of that has to do with the fact, of course, the East India Company does not yet have the reach, et cetera, et cetera. Some of it, frankly, has to do with kind of, if you will, patronizing, maybe racist understandings of people living in India, these kinds of things. But whichever the reason, anyway, that Britons at the time decide the moment for India has not yet come. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We're talking with Patrick Griffin, the Harmsworth Professor at Oxford this year, and also the Madden-Hennebry Professor of History at Notre Dame, and the author of a number of books, including The Townshend Moment and the forthcoming The Age of the Atlantic Revolutions, and just talking about the kind of the global context and the Atlantic context, the imperial context for the American Revolution, which is an extraordinary story. So I'm wondering too about we've talked about the Townsend Brothers and their kind of complementary visions of empire, and their backgrounds are interesting, though. You know, one takes after the mother but lives with the father, and then vice versa. And you have these accounts of Walpole talking about Walpole was a kind of an acerbic guy. I would love to quote, because he always is very pointed in his comments on these folks. What about their personalities important in this?
Yeah, no, like it's earlier historians have done but have done like Freudian readings of the brothers.
Yeah.
You know? And it was kind of one like to be wanted too much, or like to be loved too much, and the other not enough, and everything like that.
Yeah.
And I don't completely buy it. Don't get me wrong. These people, I mean, Charles was a brilliant guy. He was a bit of a fractured guy.
Yeah.
And he clearly was under the thumb of his older brother, George. George could be a bit domineering and everything like that. George wasn't as nimble. George could be more stubborn. But George, oh my God, the guy had a backbone. He was a military man.
Oh, yeah.
I actually find more like lessen, if you will, their family histories, however interesting that is. And my God, they had a colorful family history with a colorful mother and a colorful father. Yeah. I find more in what I call their apprenticeships. The fact that George is going to be a guy who's going to serve out time in the military. You know, he's going to be over at the Battle of Quebec. Famously, he'll be in the War of Austrian Succession. He'll be on the continent. Charles is going to be working in the Board of Trade, and he quickly becomes an expert there on trade.
Right.
And I think, if anything, it's that way of kind of those ways of looking at the world. Two very different understandings of empire. One based on trade, the other based on military might. I think that more than anything else determine the way that they're going to think about this period of time after the 7 Years' War. They're complementary, but to a certain extent, those visions of empire are also complementary, and they define the two ways that Britain's going to engage with the wider world, with military might and also through commerce. You know, and so the brothers, to me anyway, are perfect representations of like what this made this empire go round. And it also reflects the way that both of them were going to kind of address kind of the tensions and issues in the moment when they were on the stage.
Right. Do the Americans, I don't mean to generalize.
Yeah.
Some Americans are down with the whole idea of empire, but then others turn on it. And is it they just didn't understand, or did they understand too well what was happening?
As I put it, you're exactly right. First off, we got to remember that as all this is happening, it's happening to these people in real time. Yeah. Right. And as it's happening to them in real time, they're trying their best to kind of like grope and figure out what the heck is going on here. Are there plans here, or what is this one-off? And what Americans are going to do, and this is what I write in the book, is that they really begin to kind of connect dots, and they begin to kind of create patterns. So what the Townsends do is, if you will, set off an equal and opposite reaction on the part of Americans. Just as the Townsends are coming up with their own visions of empire, so people living throughout the empire are going to come up with their own ideas,
Right.
and Americans are exactly going to do this. And so what they'll do is that the Stamp Act is going to be passed. But when the Stamp Act is passed, and then when it's repealed, you got to remember the Americans were jubilant when this happened. And they just like, oh, you know, and I think what they thought was, well, this was just a one-off. This was a mistake. But look, I mean, our sovereign thought well enough of us that he undid this kind of terrible, terrible mistake. So let's light some bonfires, let us some fireworks, let's go drinking, let's have a wonderful time. Isn't it great to be British?
Right, yeah.
And then what happens is you have the Townsend duties after that. And they're like, oh boy. And what they do is then they start to see design.
Right.
They start to see a pattern. And if you will, their understanding actually meets what Charles is trying to do. And as I put, it's John Dickinson, the farmer from Pennsylvania, who, if anything, is going to put his finger right on that point and say, that's what it is. This is design. That's what's going on. This isn't about a one-off. This is something that they're trying to do at the center. And I think that this, if you will, is a critical turning point. And it's a critical turning point because for many Americans, this is where they begin to think about empire in a fundamentally different kind of way. And we can see it with how popular Dickinson's writings were. It takes off. It becomes, everyone's consuming it. But I think they do so because you're going to see later on with the Abbé Sieyès, like at the time of the French Revolution, when he says, you know, the nation, we are the nation, the people are the nation, you know? He's going to put his finger exactly on an issue that's going to capture people's imaginations just like Dickinson does.
Great. We've been talking with Patrick Griffin, the Harmsworth Professor of History at Oxford and the Madden-Hennebry Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame, author of many books, the Townshend Moment being one of the most recent, and the Age of the Atlantic Revolutions coming forward. Anything else we should talk about, Patrick? This has been a great discussion of these issues.
No, I think we've hit on so many, but I can just say this anyway. It's such an exciting time to be kind of working on these kinds of things. You know, it's so funny, but you think of all the generations that have covered the American Revolution, you think, what else can there be possibly be said? But it's just like we discover new things to say and new things to talk about, which is why I think we just find it endlessly fascinating.
Right. It really is. And I want to thank everyone for joining us in this conversation. We are here every week. And if you have an idea for something you'd like to hear about or a topic to discuss, send me an email, rallison@suffolk.edu. And I'll look forward to seeing and talking to everyone again. So thanks for joining us, Patrick.
Oh, thanks so much, Bob. I loved it. It's great.
And that will be piped out on the road to Boston.